Hello everybody, welcome to the Eternal Spoiler Breakdown. My name is Pojo, and today we are breaking down live on stream all of the many spoilers that were revealed today and possibly yesterday for Eternal, the upcoming set Dark Frontier. It is pretty wild what's been going on. Like, there's been basically a batch of 15 spoilers released as community spoilers to the spoilers store. We didn't purchase any of these, but there are like a bunch of them that have been spoiled by a bunch of different people. And yeah, like some of them are interesting cards. There's some really decent stuff in the batch. There's also some like interesting commons. There's some hints about cycles that we might be seeing. Based on what I've seen of the set so far, I would say that this is probably not going to be a continuation of the tri-faction colors and may not even continue to cycle out the merchants. I think there's a pretty solid likelihood that this set is going to be pretty focused on more monocolor factions, more dual color pairings, sort of going back to basics and getting away from some of the craziness that has been our tri-faction set Defiance. So yeah, there's some interesting stuff going on with it. We also have this ridiculous card over here, Even-Handed Golem, which is probably one of the wackiest cards that we've seen released in terms of like overall possible impact. So it's a 2-cost 2/2 with summon. If you have no odd cost cards in your deck, draw 2 cards. Obviously no odd cost cards is a significant drawback, but this is also a card that of like all of the different interesting build around me mechanics and weird crazy setups that we can possibly get, like this is one that potentially actually has a lot of strength to it. So obviously you can't have 1-cost or 3-cost cards. That means you can't have merchants or smugglers, which that alone probably leaves Even-Handed Golem out of most tier 1 decks, but that draw 2 cards effect is very powerful, and if you can find some ways to get around the restriction or use the restriction to your advantage, I think there's going to be a decent chance that Even-Handed Golem can really work for you. Basically, it will provide you with a lot of interesting deck choices for more aggressive style decks that are only using primarily 2-drops and 4-drops. So some interesting potential in there. We're definitely going to be playing around with it a bunch. There's some cool decks that it'll go into. We'll play it in a bunch of different decks. I think it's interesting that it is a colorless card. It belongs in quite a lot of different factions. And yeah, I'm curious to see exactly how this card will work. There's not a lot of dials to adjust on it. It is a 2/2 for 2, and that's pretty much where it should stay. You could maybe take it down to a 1/1 if it got like too overpowered, but like it's reasonably well statted for being a 2-drop. The summon ability is very powerful. So if you're playing it in a deck that can actually actively use a really weird curve or a bent curve, you can potentially do some really cool stuff with that. I think the thing that it's most likely to belong in is in relic decks, specifically anything with a mix of cards like Severin and Akanthas, where you can essentially discount the cards and do interesting things to sort of like make the whole setup fit together a little better. But yeah, and it basically, like, there's going to be a lot of different ways that you can play with Even-Handed Golem, and building Even-Handed Golem decks should be a lot of fun. I don't think it'll ever necessarily be a tier 1 card, which hopefully it doesn't, because like that could be pretty meta breaking and they'd probably have to change it if it were, but like it definitely has got some interesting possibilities. You can do some discounting things with cards like Trail Stories, Yeti Sage, other things where you can sort of like make things cheaper to improve your curve a little bit. You can't do the obvious Stone Shaker or anything that reduces the cost of cards, because if they reduce the cost of cards in your deck, then you actually don't get to play the draw 2 anymore. So there are definitely like problems with those types of strategies. I think getting around this restriction is going to be very difficult. It's going to be better and easier to just build on that curve and then play around with minor cost reductions or small things that might get around that restriction, like Northwind Herald, for example, or anything where you can actually just get like some interesting cheap effects out of it. So yeah, it's an odd card. It's definitely got some interesting potential to it, and as like a lead-in to like, hey, would you like some interesting Johnny build-arounds me's, I think it's got a lot of potential. Okay, so the rest of these are community spoilers. There's a pile of them. I'm not sure what the most exciting one is. Probably we'll leave Bren for last, because there is a new Bren, and it looks pretty good. But we'll go ahead and start, I think, up at the top here with Cryptic Master. Cryptic Master is a 2-cost 1/1 with +1/+1 for each of your relics, and on slot, play a Cryptic Etchings. So typically a 2-cost 2/2 if you are playing 1-drops, although it is fairly hard to effectively get it out in other situations. There aren't that many aggressive 1-drops in time, but if you're playing Praxis colors, this works really, really well. It's an easy way to get Cryptic Etchings, which is a relic that just for its cost is not very efficient. But if you're playing a 2/2 unit on top of it that then gets bigger and bigger the more relics that you have, I think that's actually going to work out pretty well for you. So this card actually seems very, very strong. The main problem with it, of course, is that like you do have to attack with a unit. If you're playing like your traditional time-based stuff, typically your 1-drop's going to be Initiative of the Sands, which means that very frequently you're not actually going to want to attack with Initiative of the Sands to get your Cryptic Master out. So that's going to be like a little bit of an issue there. But overall, like relic-based aggro and general like time-based stuff seems really interesting. There are some issues with the card, particularly that it is not an Explorer, which is I think that's kind of, it's almost a missed opportunity. It would be very powerful as an Explorer, because Explorers and Relics and Sentinels all have intertwined synergies with each other. So if you're playing with, say, Lucky Prospector, and you attack with a Lucky Prospector and then play Cryptic Master, your Lucky Prospector goes up to a 3/3, your Cryptic Master goes up to a 2/2, and then potentially you can do some other interesting things with it. So yeah, like I would say that this card like would be nice if it was an Explorer, especially since it's got like some definite Explorer synergy going on with it. But otherwise, I like the card a lot. I think it's actually pretty powerful. You could feasibly see it in some good time aggro decks, and it plays around a lot with Aurelian in particular as a faction to be developed. So since we're already seeing some good Aurelian decks, especially with cards like Rat Cage and other interesting shenanigans that you can do, like this is great in a Rat Cage deck. Yeah, this is a card that I think actually will see play in maybe even tier 1 decks. It's very powerful, and it's got some good upscaling potential if it actually gets that Onslaught. Onslaught is one of the easier abilities to activate, I think. Most of the time being aggressive is usually going to be a pretty easy thing. It is a drawback that you don't get a good bonus if you don't play the Cryptic Etchings on the turn, but there are probably going to be plenty of interesting Onslaught enablers and other ways that you can play around with it, and usually attacking with a 1-drop, that doesn't seem like it's going to be too big a deal, so I think this card's going to be relatively powerful. Okay, next up we have Dizo's Racket. I think we're going in alphabetical order after we skipped Bren. But yeah, Dizo's Racket is a pretty good one. It basically says, hey, instead of gaining armor, how would you like to not gain armor? Whenever you gain armor with Dizo's Racket, you draw that many cards and take twice that much damage, meaning that you effectively get the armor, draw the cards, then deal enough damage to yourself to remove the armor completely. So with Dizo's Racket active, I believe you can't play relic weapons. Like Auric Runehammer is maybe the only one that will work with Dizo's Racket because you're immune to the damage, which is pretty wild. But like basically anything else, if you play the relic weapon, it will immediately destroy the relic weapon and you won't get any sort of good benefits. Good with Runehammer though, that's a really, really fun one. So like, yeah, it's a justice-based, if you want to do a justice-based deck that has a lot of interesting armor bonuses, you can get very, very good benefits from Dizo's Racket. The disadvantage, of course, is that you will be taking damage for each card that you draw, which is not typically a difficult price to pay in Shadow, but occasionally does have some issues. I would say that overall it is reasonably good, and you can do some pretty cool stuff with it. Someone is suggesting Last Stand at the Gate, which I believe kills you instantly. Yeah, you pay 7, you go down to 1 health, you get 6 armor, and you die immediately. But you draw 12 cards in the process, so that's lovely. So yeah, like if you combine this with like some immunity to damage effects, there are ways that you can sort of cheat around Dizo's Racket. But in general, you're going to be playing it in a deck that uses a lot of armor-based strategies, especially the cards that gain armor, which are fairly underplayed. People don't usually run Roland's Favor, but Roland's Favor is a draw 3 with this particular setup. You can run Grit as a draw 4 effectively, or a Warp draw 3. There are some interesting options here, and certainly you can get a lot of cool stuff happening, which should be really, really solid for you overall. Yeah, like I think this card's pretty good. It's got some interesting possibilities, and you can even turn Relic Weapons into weird draw spells as opposed to Relic Weapons, which is kind of wild. I think there's definitely some interesting possibilities with that. Dizo's Racket is a really interesting build around me, and it's a rare as well, so I think there's some good potential to build some pretty cool popper decks that can do some neat stuff with it. So yeah, worth trying out. Definitely has some interesting possibilities. Plays well with lifesteal more than it plays well with armor, but obviously you want some armor or relic weapons in it in the first place. And I kind of take back what I said about just being about getting armor cards. You actually might want to play certain relic weapons in this deck, just because they are useful cards that once you play Racket, Racket turn into draw spells, and that kind of flexibility and changeability is actually potentially very good. So yeah, Dieso's Racket is, I think, my favorite of the spoilers in terms of like just weird game-changing potential. It's a fancy, fun card. It does some really sweet stuff. Next up is Firecoin. Oh, okay, this one's a little bit bigger, which makes sense. It is part of a new cycle of power. It's not amazing, but it's definitely got some interesting possibilities to it. And I would say that, like, overall, there's some good stuff going on with it that could be really, really good depending on how you're looking at it. So Firecoin is a depleted fire sigil that has Onslaught, deal 1 damage to an enemy. And deal 1 damage to an enemy is pretty powerful. Like, we know from Vara's Favor that basically having power or any sort of power-seeking effect that actually has the ability to just ping people snowball style can be really, really effective, and you can get a lot of benefit out of it and kill a lot of things. You can push for lethal in certain places where you wouldn't otherwise be able to have it. Even 1 damage worth of reach can be better than having no damage worth of reach. You can also use it to kill units that are just a little bit bigger than you, or to mess with enemy units that are just maybe not quite working out for you. The main disadvantage to this is that you do have to attack, which means that you can't play Firecoin as like a fast spell effect or anything like that. So if you're trying to make a difference, you probably have to commit to a fairly bad trade first, and then play Firecoin as your power afterwards. One thing that's going to be interesting about the coin cycle in general, which I'm sure it is a cycle, is that like the coin cycle will make it so that playing power after your first attack phase or after attacking is going to be the norm, not the standard. So if you're the type of person who currently draws cards, plays your power, and then does whatever you're going to do, like makes your attack, does something along those lines, don't do that. Start practicing using your power after your attack on your second main phase if you're going to make an attack in a turn, because basically like cards like Firecoin are going to influence tricks in a way that people are going to have to be able to play around them. And so this is something where you're going to really want to actually change your gameplay style to match what's going on in the current meta. So something to keep an eye on. But yeah, like overall, this card, I don't think it's that strong. I'm actually not sure if we're going to be seeing a lot of play for it in Fire, just because depleted Fire is like really not something you're looking for. I have a suspicion that the other coins will be a lot stronger, and there's a possibility that we can actually do some cool things with them. But maybe it's just not going to be that good. A lot of the common power that has been coming out right now hasn't been that great. Tokens of Vision and all of the tokens were not particularly awesome. Firecoin, I'm just not sure. It seems like it's decent. There's like definitely power is always a good thing, and more power allows you to build decks more flexibly, which means that oftentimes these types of cards will find their way into decks that might actually have a space to use it. But yeah, I'm very curious to see exactly what this ends up doing. But yeah, the other thing that's kind of cool about it is that you can certainly use it with any sort of effect that allows you to play power, like Display of Vision. This actually might improve Display of Vision quite a bit if you can just grab whatever type of coin that you like out of your deck and play it to mess up your opponent's strategy. So the coin cycle is going to be really interesting. I'm looking forward to seeing them all, and hopefully we get some really, really cool stuff out of it. But yeah, being able to play power out of your void or out of your deck could be something that increases the potential of these cards quite a bit. All right, next up is Angry Prophet. This is a 2-cost 1/2 with +1 strength for each of your other units. That's not a terrible stat line, but I think it's a pretty bad card. 2-cost 1/2 is not very good. After it gets better, it's maybe a 3/2 for 2 blank. Then, you know, like if it ends up being like a 5/2 for 2 with a bunch of units on board, I don't think you care. Overall, this card seems like a pretty mediocre vanilla unit, but if you can give it unblockable in a board full of units, or if you have some interesting things that you can synergize with, then there's certainly some potential for this card to be played. But overall, I feel like it's not going to do quite enough. It doesn't have any good synergies. It's a rogue rather than a gunslinger or any other type of unit, so it doesn't really play well with grenadins or gunslingers or anything that has like that kind of extra tribal benefit. Like, I'm not seeing a lot of value for this card overall, and like a 2-cost 3/2 is kind of under par if it's a vanilla unit. Angry Prophet is a silenceable 1/2 that frequently won't even be that good, so I'm not really into it. I think it's going to be a pretty bad card, and overall it's going to be a card that's going to be really awkward to play with in draft even. So there's some possibilities for it, but this looks like the sort of common draft unit that you're going to be seeing a lot of that kind of influences the flow of a draft game. but like also is something that you might want to pass if you don't have if you have other better 2-drops available. So yeah, it's curious, but I don't think it's actually very good. So we will see. You will see what ends up happening with it. Okay, next up we have Omnivorous Vorlon. This is a Killer Overwhelm 3/1 for 3 in double time. Overall decent. I would say that this card is reasonably exciting just for the ability to murder things with Overwhelm. Like, having Killer and Overwhelm attached to each other is very strong, as Dawnwalker can attest, although one of the things about Dawnwalker is that it has that recursive element that tends to be very, very powerful. I would say that this is actually feasibly going to be a very good card in certain Xenon Killer-based decks, where you are dark returning it, bringing it back with Back for More, or the 2-cost card that revives it with Exhaust. There may be other ways to bring it back from the void over and over again, so any ways that you can benefit it and buff it up could really give you some very solid removal in time and potentially get you into much better shape. This card works really well with Praxis Arcanum because you can give it cards, you can give it both Refresh and Deadly, both of which are extremely strong, and then use extra Dark Return effects to give it even more strength and do other stuff. Omnivorous Vorlon always goes to the void after killing whatever it's supposed to kill, which means that basically any type of void-based shenanigans are going to be really, really powerful there. Yeah, Refresh being the 0/4 extra bonus, so making it like a 3/5 could be kind of fun. I don't think, yeah, so I think that like this card actually is probably going to be very good for a Xenon Killer based archetype. The other thing about it is a dinosaur. It's a cheap dinosaur, and for 3 it's one of the better dinosaurs that you can get. Baying Cerasora has too much of a drawback. Voracious Visora also has too much of a drawback. There's a 3-cost that gives Killer but has Reckless. Like, most of the dinosaurs at 3 aren't actually all that good, and this one actually benefits a lot from different dino buffs, which always leads you back into whether or not certain cards like the Ambush dinosaur that gives +1/+1 to dinosaurs, or the Nightfall dinosaur that gives its attack to dinosaurs could potentially be used. Those cards are still very bad, but there's a lot of different dinosaur strategies, and Vorlon's probably going to play into those while also playing into Xenon Killers. Since it actually benefits 2 different archetypes that currently exist and are currently perfectly decent, I think that that's going to be a pretty good card. So, like, this might potentially bring dinosaurs into a better spot, and I'm always interested in seeing some dinosaur tribal. I don't think it's ever been a tier 1 deck, and this is one of those cards that could actually help bring it up there. It's not the sole defining card that brings it up there, but it's something that I think definitely would belong in a dinosaur killers deck, and should hopefully like get you some benefits. Okay, Oni Patrol, 2/1 Onslaught, +1/+1. There's no Oni Ronin in this card, actually. This is like very similar to the standard Oni. So this is a 3/2/4/1 if you have attacked, which if you're attacking with an Oni Ronin, that gives you 2 3/2s on turn 1, or on turn 2, which is, yeah, maybe pretty good. You can get some pretty decent benefits out of that. It seems like a solid aggro card. It's very limited in scope, but it's decent enough in draft that you can actually do some interesting stuff with it. If you have some good ways to give the cards quick draw, or just sort of benefit off of those stats, I think there's some potential to actually get some decent results off of Oni Patrol. Overall, this seems like a really strong draft card for the aggro tempo plays that like most fire decks really want to go with. There aren't that many common 1-drops, and this is one that can potentially benefit that type of style. If you're not playing hyper aggressive aggro, I just don't think Oni Patrol is worth it. Again, like it is a little bit stat efficient if you've got the Onslaught effect, and the Onslaught effect is not that hard to get, but basically, like, if you're not playing just like almost entirely mono 1-drops, or a draft deck that tops out at like 4 or 5, then I think that you're probably looking for other things than Oni Patrol. Still, 1-cost 2/1 is a decent enough stat line. This card counts as an Oni. I kind of wish it played a weapon on itself as opposed to a +1/+1, since that way it would synergize better with cards like Gunslingers and the Egan's site. I can't remember the name of that site, but basically any at this point it's just like a mild buff to the card that you can then replay over and over again. Egan's Workshop, yes, that's the name of the card. So yeah, like there's some potential for this card. It's definitely pretty aggressive. It's stat efficient, and like a 2/1 is good enough for 1. As we've proven with cards like Drifter and Oni Ronin, like that is just like a reasonable stat line, and there aren't enough of them, so having more of them is definitely a good way to increase the strength and power of aggro in both ranked and draft. So should be pretty good. I think it'll be pretty devastating in draft just because getting a lot of these could lead to pretty ugly stuff pretty quickly. Okay, we're going to skip Bren for a moment, but we'll come back to him. Next up is Reread. This one is draw a spell from your void and it gets void bound. Hey, I'm so happy to have spell recursion. So this is similar to like Excavate in terms of giving things void bound, but the fact that you can basically get any spell that you want back and then give it void bound is a pretty useful effect. Like you can use this to pick out particular spells that you might need from the void if you're playing around with Sporefolk decks or anything that mills you. If you're playing around with Herald Song, the draw discard, Honor of Claws is pretty capable of getting cards into the void that you might actually want back. Reread does not have any of the benefits of Dark Return where it gives you some sort of extra effect. In fact, the effect that you get is indeed a drawback, but overall, this card gives you effectively a tutor type effect at 2, where if you are playing a bunch of different cards, you'll be able to pick out particular toolkits that you need to win the game exactly when you need them. I think control decks are really going to want that, and since it's not at a card disadvantage, unlike Excavate or other options, I think this actually will see some play in blue control decks and other types of spell-related decks that want to do really, really fun things. Yeah, you can even do some cool stuff with this with Diogo Malaga, the new Diogo Malaga Alons, which is just like quite capable of getting amplify cards with Destiny, playing those cards, then rereading those cards for an extra card draw, although not being able to reread it again afterwards. So but yeah, seems like a reasonably effective card. It is limited in scope, but very strong in control, and overall I think that this actually does open up more counterspell archetypes and more control-based archetypes if you're the type of person who likes to run blue spell-based decks. All right, Seal of Devotion. We got more power here. This one's pretty exciting. It's got Warp while you have no more than one type of influence. So, like, it is a monocolored reward card that kind of works at cross purposes with a lot of the standard monocolored rewards, but there are quite a few monocolored decks that don't really want to run those rewards anyways. Like Shadow decks often frequently don't want to run Devouring Shadow. It's an okay removal card, but Mono Shadow isn't like particularly about Devouring Shadow. Mantle of Justice is an okay Mono Justice card, but basically like at this point we're hitting a good enough mass of like really, really good units in particular colors that we can actually run monocolored decks that potentially have the advantage of being able to play color cards of a color that basically like there is no color. So yeah, there's some potential there. The main problem with this is that like there are cards like Word of Soul that already exist that also count as extra card advantage, so it's kind of competing in that slot for this kind of setup. And Seal of Devotion, while not a depleted power and potentially like not going to be like too difficult to work with, does have some potential to basically just not be exactly what you want. There are some new warp cards in the set, and they are in multiple colors, so that's going to be pretty fun to deal with. I'm excited to see this card in particular in conjunction with a bunch of other warp cards, because that means that if you want to do like a monocolored warp deck, then you can do some pretty interesting stuff. But like overall, I'm not sure if this card is going to see a lot of play. It's very powerful. It is a power card that you can play that draws you a card effectively, but often like it also comes with an inherent risk in monocolored decks that you're going to draw power and not be able to play cards that you actively need to play. So like if you want to get your Valkyrie Enforcer or your any sort of like triple green card, then it's going to be a little bit trickier to play this. I'd say overall it seems decently strong, but it's hard to say exactly to what extent you're going to want it. Certainly there's some decent potential for it. But yeah, there's also some big monocolored payoff cards, at least one that we know of, a legendary that costs 5 Shadow, which with Seal of Devotion might be a little bit hard to pull off. So I'm curious to see exactly how much play this card sees, but I would say overall it is a pretty strong improvement to a lot of monocolored decks and should make those faction pairings quite a bit stronger. That combined with the coins could potentially lead to some interesting situations. Okay, Speckies Faithful is Warp Onslaught +2/+2. This is a 2-cost 1/1, which is a little bit on the weak side, but it's a 2-cost 3/3 with Onslaught, and as I mentioned, Onslaught is not typically that difficult to put together. If you compare this to Blinkwolf, the 2/1 with Warp, which I always thought was a pretty reasonable card, it was I played it a couple of times in mono red decks and had okay times with it. This seems like it might actually be a decent card overall. It's basically a decent 2-drop, as it is a 3/3 in stat lines if you get the Onslaught, which is better than the 3/2 that we were talking about previously. So if you're playing a fairly aggressive deck, getting a 3/3 for 2 definitely doesn't seem like that bad a deal. And if you're playing with, like, say, District Infantry to start and playing into cards like Hojin, then Speckies Faithful feels pretty decent. The Warp ability also gives you an extra amount of card draw, so yeah, like overall this card seems really, really strong overall and should be good in most like sort of aggressive draft formats as well. Like certainly there's some good potential for this card to do interesting things. It's mostly a vanilla 2, but like a 2-cost 3/3 is definitely not bad, and if you get to effectively draw a card while playing it, then yeah, that's a pretty significant bonus and will help you win the game in quite a few situations. All right, last card before Bren is Eclipse Dragon, which is a draft bomb, of course. Flying charge quick draw. At the start of the enemy turn, you get +3 power this turn. So, fairly aggressive dragon. About as well statted as a dragon can be at 5. Like 4/4 for 5 is the same as there's a current warp dragon that's a 4/4 for 5, and that card is not as good. But it's got charge and quick draw, which means that it's really, really hard to kill. The ability at the start of the enemy turn, you get +3 power this turn, is kind of interesting because it's going to be relatively strong in ranked if you are playing this card to set up certain types of counterspell proofing. If you want to have like a blue-red Skycrag deck where you basically just attack with a bunch of stuff and then you can backlash Harsh Rule at the end of the turn, then yeah, that's pretty cool stuff. That's a good way to basically get yourself a little bit of extra bonuses to play around with. And you get that +3 power every single turn to play with, which means that if you set up enough of these cards, you can effectively just have like spell swipe always ready or play around with like really, really ridiculous expensive counter spells. And yeah, that's got some potential if you want to play counter spell control again. Like there's some neat possibilities for that. And like also you can do things like Display of Instinct, basically any type of good aggressive damage. You can actively kill sites very quickly and do some useful stuff that way. Like yeah, this card is just likely to give you a lot of options if you're playing a ranked spell-based deck. In draft, that effect is almost meaningless. You're probably not going to be using it all that much, but that doesn't matter because the stat line, while pretty poor in ranked, is very good in draft. Flying charge and quick draw means this is effectively very hard to get through. There are very few units that actually effectively stop this card. Tower Top Patrol is probably one of the main ones, Sirocco Glider, but like it's actually really hard to kill this unit, and it is a very big flyer, which means that it has a very good clock. So overall, this card should just rule the landscape in draft. If you ever get it, it's probably going to be one of your first picks, and yeah, it does some pretty wild and ridiculous stuff, so got some good potential. Overall, seems like a great card. Should be useful in both ranked and draft, and just the right power level, I think, for a rare. So strong, strong stuff. Okay, last one. All right, so we're to the lore bits. So we all know that through the storyline of late, pre-Defiance, in fact, and what we are moving into with the current storyline is basically all of the current Scions have formed a triumvirate with Talir as the central advisor to Caleb, Aylin, and Vara. So Talir is basically like currently hanging out at Argenport, showing Aylin, Vara, and Caleb how it's done. And as such, she is not in the Praxis Arcanum, which means the Praxis Arcanum needs a new Archmagister. Fortunately, we have somebody waiting in the wings, and that is Bren, Archmagister. So Brenan is a 5/5 for 7 that says when you play another card, you get +1 power this turn. And that's pretty interesting for a variety of reasons. Now, similar to cards like Witching Hour, other things like that, one thing to note about this card is that this counts all cards played by cards that you play. So if you play, say, Assembly Line, then you pay 3, you get 1 power back for the card that you played, which is Assembly Line, and then you get 1 power each for each of the Grenadin that you played. So you will get an effective +1 power total, in addition to to a free spell from Assembly Line. If you do this with New Tomorrow, you get +1 power because you played 10 power cards. If you do this with Forgotten Find, you get +1 power because you played 2 power cards. So basically anything where you get to play a bunch of units or a bunch of other things off of a card effectively allows you to get some really, really good benefits and get some extra ramp off of Bren. But overall, the thing that's really useful about Bren is that whenever you have Bren down, you are capable of basically playing certain cards into other cards and getting just really, really good benefits off of them. So Invoke the Waystones always gets a +2 power back, which is really good if you want to start invoking the Waystones again. If you're playing with additional the smaller Brens, then you can get quite a bit of power off of this guy and play basically infinite amounts of spells. So Bren is typically going to be limited more by the size of your hand than by the amount of power that you can put out. So there's a lot of potential things that you can do to do really, really ridiculous stuff. If you want to generate a lot of power on very quickly, then you could do things like Witching Hour to pay 0 to play four cards and get +5 power. There's a lot of interesting possibilities for this card in terms of just getting weird win con out. Stat line wise, not that strong. 5/5 for 7 is pretty weak. This is a really interesting effect at 7, I would say, as opposed to at 8, since it's a card that requires some setup to actually get the big benefit that you're looking for, which includes things like Flame Blast. If you want to play a very, very large Flame Blast, Bren is probably one of your best tools in the faction pairing, and could potentially get you to some very, very good places. This card plays really well with Diogo Malaga Alons, with all of the extra spells that Diogo gets, because you can then get a pile of extra power of that. Plays really well with Invoke the Waystones, plays really well with any type of Assembly Line combo stuff, Kenedins. If you want to do weird, interesting shenanigans, I think Bren's got your back. I'm not specifically sure, and I would say that this is the main drawback to the card, is that I'm not specifically sure what type of deck he actually belongs in, because he is a card that you have to play down and then still effectively get some amount of benefit out of him, and Bren does not have an immediate impact on board on the turn that he's played unless you have some 0-cost spells to get the ball rolling. So it's pretty hard to actually get the amount of power that you need out of this card. I would say this is a really serious combo enabler, so what's going to determine whether Bren is strong or not is whether or not the combo exists for Bren that you can effectively use it. And typically Direwolf is very, very careful with these types of combos. Infinite combos are very, very tricky. They're often not easy to put together. They typically don't end up in tier 1 decks. Talir combo, I think, was about the closest one for a while, and that was usually more or less a tier 2 list. I would really not be surprised to see Bren have some very, very good combos that already exist. I wouldn't even be surprised to see players finding some ways to break Bren and make some really, really interesting stuff happen. But my suspicion is that there's probably going to be a couple of decent combos out there that Bren can use, and they're going to be a little bit too hard to set up to effectively make this card a very, very powerful ranked setup. Nonetheless, the card is hilarious to play with. It's got some amazing stuff that we already want to do with it, and it's so much fun to play with. I absolutely can see no reason why we wouldn't want to do cool stuff with it. He does do things like discount all of Zoe's plundering treasures, which are really cool. If you want to use that with Tamaris the Geomancer, you could potentially draw just a huge pile of cards and then get a bunch of power and use that to Flame Blast your opponent out. There's some really, really fun setups that you can do, and all of the decks that Bren goes in are going to be a lot of fun to play, and that's really what I ask out of my sweet, sweet legendaries. So I'm excited to see this card. This card is pretty awesome, and overall I'm pretty excited for what's coming up in the current set. Most of the cards that we've seen in the community spoilers have been cards that I would not say are fantastic descriptors of what's going on in the set, but we also don't know what the new mechanics are going to be or what other stuff is going to be out there, so I'm curious to see more about what this set is going to be about mechanically. Thus far it seems like it's going to be a lot of aggression, potentially some monocolored rewards, because there's both the coins and the warp card that rewards monocolored specifically. It looks like it's going to be returned to more focused decks in particular colors and more color identity in general, so that's going to be interesting. I think it's going to be really, really fun to play. It should make for a very compelling draft environment, especially after the current sort of tribal setup that we have right now at the moment. I think that that's going to be really, really fun to play. Overall, I'm just psyched for the change, and I think that this set looks like it's going to be pretty full of interesting, strong cards, and I'm really excited to get back into the lore and start doing more stuff with the Shadowlands, finding out a little bit more about all of the general secrets that have been kept. So yeah, let's see how this whole set turns out. But overall, I'm pretty happy with what it's going for so far. That's it for me for today. Thank you guys so much for watching. And yeah, I have a Patreon. If you want to subscribe to that, that helps out. You can find me on Twitch at twitch.tv/LocoPojo, where I will often be doing these spoiler breakdowns. And I am, of course, on YouTube, so feel free to subscribe to me if you have not already. Thank you guys so much for watching, and I will see you all next time. Cheers.